Good morning. How's it going? Good. Okay. Decent response. So if you're anything like me, oftentimes you can be so focused on the next thing that you miss out on the present thing. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where you're just constantly looking out ahead as to what's next, that you miss what's happening in the moment. Or you might miss what God is saying or what God has said to you in the past. And this is the time of year when people start looking out ahead to the next year. I don't know if you've already started doing this or not, but people start making what's called New Year's resolutions, right? That last for about 3 weeks. And then we give up on them, we go back to our own ways, whatever. But this is around the time that people start looking at the next year. But before we do that, even though that has some merit and it can have some value, before we look at what's coming or what's next, we want to take today to look back on what has God said. Because so often, so many times, we can just blow through what God has said or what God is saying because we're just trying to focus on the next thing. But there's a value in reflection. I think this is one of the most underrated spiritual disciplines. It's the spiritual discipline of reflection. I'm at my best whenever I have some rhythm of reflection, where at the end of the day, I prayerfully take before the Lord the events, the actions, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions of that day, and just bring them to God and say, Lord, where were you in today? Help me see where you were at work in today. When there's some sort of rhythm of reflection, it can be super helpful and healthy for us. And this is something that we do not only as individuals, but something that we do as a church, where we take the last Sunday of the year and we just reflect on what are some of the things that God said to us throughout the year. And as we prepare and as we begin to look forward for what's ahead, we just take a moment to recall to mind what God has said and celebrate the wins and the testimonies that have come out of this year. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to start by reviewing some of the series that we've gone through. For many of you, this is going to be just review. You've heard some of these things. So it's not going to be new information, but it can still be helpful to hear. Because so many times we can hear something and be like, that's a great point. I should really do something about that. And we never do. And so some of this may be a refresher, some of this may be news, but either way, it's all going to be good. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the Mark series that we went through, the good news of Jesus. And so we started the year out, one of the first big series that we did this year was going through the gospel according to Mark. For those of you who are part of our Wednesday crowd, we went through every chapter in the book of Mark on Wednesdays. We did a similar thing on Sundays. And I want to start with this text from Mark chapter 8. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say that you're one of the other prophets." And then he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And that was what we looked at through that whole gospel. Was Mark's primary objective is to put Jesus in front of us and ask us this question: who do you say that he is? Mark opens the gospel in chapter 1, verse 1 with the only time that he provides his commentary on who he thinks Jesus is. He says this: the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And this is a very punk rock thing for Mark to do, because at that time, the person who was heralded as the Son of God was the Caesar. And Mark here is saying, hey, I know that everyone is saying that this guy is the true Son of God, but let me tell you about someone else, the true and rightful king. And so that's how he starts off, and it's an awesome way to kick it off. So that's the one time he tells us what he thinks, and then the rest he tells us what Jesus does and what others say about him. We see the Pharisees think that Jesus is a blasphemer and that he's demon-possessed. We see that his family thinks he's crazy. We see that his hometown thinks he's a fraud. King Herod says that he's John resurrected. And then in the center of the gospel according to Mark, we see this question being asked by his disciples: who is this man? And that's the key question for all of us. Who do we say that Jesus is? Because it's one thing for everyone else to have this opinion about him, but what's most important is, what do you say about Jesus? Who is he to you? How do you view him? And we looked at this in different parts. We looked at how Jesus is the anointed king. He didn't come out of thin air. Jesus came from a long history of the people of Israel waiting for and longing for God's anointed king, his Messiah, that would come and not only be the king of Israel, but would be king of the whole world, bringing righteousness and justice into the world. We also saw how Jesus is the unexpected king. He is the one who called the unqualified. Thank God for that, because we're all unqualified. I was recently talking to a friend, and he said, man, I'm really excited about how God is using me to witness to people that I work with and to lift them up and encourage them. And he said, that's great, but I just feel so unqualified. And I said, welcome to the club. Like, everyone who is doing what God has told them to do is doing something that they aren't qualified for. We're all, taking a step in faith, going beyond our means because we are operating in his means, not our own. So Jesus calls the unqualified. We also saw how Jesus heals the unclean. He serves the undeserving. We're all undeserving. Jesus owes you nothing. Everything that we have from him is a gift. We aren't entitled to anything. But God, in his gracious mercy, has lavished upon us his love and his forgiveness, and what a gift that is. So many times we can just get entitled to think that God owes us these things. Let's not forget that we were once far from God, that we were all children of wrath, and we wanted nothing to do with him, yet he continued to love us in spite of that. So he serves the undeserving. We also saw how he restores the undone. If you remember in that sermon, we were going through Mark chapter 5, and we were going through the story of Jairus and his wife, who had an unexpected tragedy happen in their family with the death of their daughter. And I find it fitting today to review this, that Jesus is the unexpected king who restores those who are in moments where they are completely undone because of life's unexpected tragedies. So this past week on Christmas Eve, there was a tragic accident just in our own backyard here in Sherman that resulted in the loss of a father and his daughter in a car accident. He was Durant's high school girls coach, Will Robinson, and his daughter passed away on Christmas Eve, and an unspeakable tragedy that this family is now experiencing. And my hope and my prayer, and there's so many things that can be said about that situation, but my hope and my prayer is that in the midst of this unexpected tragedy, that they would sense the presence of the unexpected king. That just like Jairus, who was in a place where he was in the gap between what he expected and now the reality that he's faced with, that though he was in the gap of the unexpected, he wasn't there alone, because in that gap was the unexpected king. And so that's my hope and my prayer for that family, and prayers go out to all of our first responders who have diligently worked on that situation. And you may look at something like that, maybe that particular story, or maybe you have your own version of it that you've personally walked through, and you look at it and you go, man, in the midst of something like that bad, that terrible, that unjust, how in the world can God be good? See, Jesus isn't just the anointed king, and he's not just the unexpected king, but Jesus is also the crucified king. See, Jesus did not excuse himself from the experience of human suffering, but instead he entered into it and took upon himself the worst of it. See, Jesus became king, but the way that he did it was in a way that no one saw coming, because his crown was a crown of thorns and his throne was a Roman cross, taking upon himself the punishment that was not due to him, absorbing all of the injustice, all of the hatred, all of the evil, all of the sin upon his shoulders. And what did he do in response? Father, forgive them. Jesus was the crucified king. But as we saw on Easter Sunday, Jesus isn't just the crucified king, but he's now the risen king. He has defeated death, hell, and the grave, and everything changes because of this event. If this is true, if Jesus really did raise from the dead, this changes absolutely everything. Because if he lived, if he was raised from the dead, death no longer has the final say. Sickness no longer has the final say. Disease no longer has the final say. Our failures and our sin and our shortcoming no longer have the final say. When we experience tragedy, when we experience sorrow and loss, we may grieve, but we don't grieve as those without hope. Because he lives, there is hope in a world beyond what we're experiencing right now, a day whenever he will come again to judge the living and the dead, to bring his kingdom, his righteousness, his justice, and establish it fully on the earth, where he'll wipe away every tear, where every wrong will be made right. Jesus is the risen king, and we look forward to that day. And that's why we gather together every Sunday, is to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. We're not just going through the motions here. We're coming and we're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus and the implications that that has on the whole world. It's not just about the motion, going through the motions. It's about coming into a life-giving relationship with the King of the world. And one of the cornerstones for a relationship is communication, which brings us to the next series that I want to highlight. We went through a series this year on hearing God. I want to read this text from Mark chapter 12. It says, "And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, asked him, 'Which commandment is the most important of all?' Jesus answered. Jesus said this, 'The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.'" What I want you to see here is Jesus is answering the question, what is the most important commandment? And the first word out of his mouth answering this question is the word hear. In the Hebrew, it's Shema. So Jesus answering the question, what's the most important commandment, responds with the first word, hear. That's why Pete Greig, who authored a book called How to Hear God, great read, he said this, "Learning to hear God's voice, his word and his whisper, is the single most important thing you'll ever learn to do." It's incredibly important that we learn how to hear God's voice, how to discern when God is speaking to us. One of the biggest hurdles that people have, one of the biggest hang-ups people have in learning how to hear God's voice is they think that hearing God is for someone else, like it's not for them. Hearing God is what the super spiritual people do, not me. Like I'm a normal person. And what we see is that's not the case. Jesus says in John chapter 10, he says, "My sheep hear my voice." He didn't say my super spiritual sheep will hear my voice, or my prophetic sheep will hear my voice, or my on staff at a church sheep will hear my voice. He says, "My sheep will hear my voice." If you are in Christ, then this is part of your birthright. You can hear the voice of God. Now, it takes time to learn how to discern that, how to perceive it. But know this, that God is speaking. God speaks in a variety of ways, and we looked at some of the ways that he speaks. God speaks first and foremost through Jesus. Jesus is what God has to say. We also look at how God speaks to us through Scripture, through sacrament, through the Spirit, things like dreams and visions. God can speak to us through peace, the prophetic word, and also the still small voice. And for me, it may be different for you, but for me, one of the most frequent ways that God speaks to me is through that still small voice. And another big hurdle that people have, a misconception, is they think that, man, if God was speaking to me, it would be so obvious I couldn't miss it. But what we found is that far more often, God's native tongue seems to be more like a whisper. It's subtle enough that you can easily mistake it even for your own thoughts. Why would God choose to speak in a whisper? Because that's kind of annoying. I would rather him make it super, super plain and obvious, something where I can't miss it. And if you remember in that series, the threshold of what I need in front of me to not miss it is very high, okay? I miss some clues sometimes from my wife about what she wants for Christmas. Okay, but moving on. But I didn't this year. I got the hint, okay? I'm growing, we're all maturing and learning. But sometimes God speaks to us in a whisper, not because he's trying to be evasive, but because he's trying to be intimate. See, a whisper isn't impossible to hear. It's just hard to hear unless you're quiet and unless you're close. So I think that's why God chooses to oftentimes speak in a whisper, is to draw us close. So the third series that we're going to look at is on finances. So this year, we did a series on money, and we did a bathroom remodel, and we still have a church. So I think I'm chalking that up as a win. That's a miracle. And yeah, so in the series on money, the whole point behind this series was to see what God's heart is on the subject. Because people can get really uncomfortable when you bring up the subject of money anywhere, but especially in church. Because there's been abuses and these different things, it's a very sensitive subject. And so our objective in going through this series was simply, what does God's word say about it, and how do we renew our minds to his truth? Because God has something to say about it, and what is it? And so one of the passages that we looked at was the example of the church in Macedonia that Paul gives in 2 Corinthians 8. So let's read this. Paul writing, he says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." So what Paul just described, completely blows our assumptions of what's possible out of the water. Because the words that he just used to describe this same group of people, we look at that and we go, those don't belong together. It's kind of like if you've ever seen a couple where you're looking at them and you're like, they don't really seem to go together. He must have a lot of money, or something like that. If you're offended by that, write a Connect card, put Pastor Terry's name on it. He'll pastor you through it. No, so you just look at those descriptions, right? Where they have severe affliction and extreme poverty. While describing the same group of people, he says, but there's also this abundance of joy that overflowed into a wealth of generosity. See, we think that in order to experience things like an abundance of joy or to engage in generosity, we need more than what we have right now. See, our mindset is, once I have a little bit more, then I can finally be happy. If I just have more, then I can finally experience peace. With just a little bit more, once I get to that level, then I'll be generous. But what happens is that wherever that more is, it's a moving target. Because once you get there, wherever there is for you, when you get there changes. And you experience lifestyle creep or these different things where it's like, I have more than, or I make more than I used to make, but it seems like I still have nothing left over to show for it. And what happens is that just becomes a moving target. And we have this mindset that begins to sink in that there's never enough. But what happens is that's an assumption that so many people walk out life with, is this mindset of just there's never enough. But what we see here is a group of people who are living in a way that completely blows that mindset out of the water. See, their mindset was, we may not have much, but we have more than enough to experience joy and to engage in generosity. We may not have it all, We may not have as much as the person down the street or the person that I see on Facebook or Instagram, but I have more than enough to experience joy and to engage in generosity. Proverbs 11 talks about how the generous prosper. It doesn't say the prosperous are generous. See, we think once I'm good, then I'll be generous. But the way it works with God seems to be the other way around. Once we're generous, then we prosper. See, the reason for that is because the reason why we give God the first and best is because it takes trust. It takes faith to give the first. It does not take faith to give the last. See, it takes faith to go, all right, God, here's some increase that's come into my hands. I want to give you the first and best and trust you with the rest. That takes faith, as opposed to, okay, here's some increase that came into my life. I'm going to make sure that I have everything covered, and then whatever's left over, God, if any, then I'll cut you your slice. That's not the way it works, because that doesn't take faith, and that's what God is after. God isn't after your money. He's after your heart, which is why he asks for the first and best, is because it takes an act of faith to do that. It's not about the money. It's about your heart. And so what we have to see in order to walk out this generous life is we have to see that we don't have a money problem, we have a mindset problem. So instead of living by this mindset of there's just not enough, we're going to change the tune. We're going to say, I may not have everything. I may not have much, but I have more than enough to experience joy and to engage in generosity. And in order to do that, you have to see God as the source and you as just simply the steward. We're not the source. Government's not the source. Our employer's not the source. God is the source. And we're just the stewards. Anything he places in our hands, we're just the managers. We just follow his lead, and that's when money with God gets really, really fun, is when you follow his lead and you get to bless people in ways that you never thought possible and see the response, the reaction that comes from that. I can tell you with certainty, it is definitely more blessing. It's definitely a greater blessing to give than it is to receive. So, we talked about being generous, but not just with our finances, also with our table practices, our homes, our time, hospitality. So one of the more recent series that we did was on the subject of hospitality. So in Luke chapter 5, it says this, "And Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with them. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at the disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?' Jesus answered them, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance.'" See, for Jesus, the table wasn't secondary to fulfilling his mission, it was central to fulfilling his mission. In the Gospel of Luke, we see what Jesus' mission is in Luke 19. Jesus saying this, he says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." That's how Jesus envisions his mission. That's what he's here to do. Seek and save the lost. That's his mission. His method, he talks about in Luke 7, when he says, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." And you say, "Look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." See, most of us eat with people who are like us. Similar stage of life, similar income level. They look like us, they dress like us, they live close to where we live. They listen to the same music that we do, they vote like us, all of these different things. We typically share a table with people who are similar to us. Jesus, on the other hand, dined with sinners. The Son of God, the righteous one, invites sinners and tax collectors to his table. Why? See, is Jesus doing this because he's giving his stamp of approval on our sin? No. Is Jesus dining with sinners because he's okay with us going on with our sinning, our lifestyles, our choices, all of these different things? He's just condoning and saying it's all good. No. Jesus dined with sinners, but he didn't sin with sinners. The reason why he dined with sinners is so that he could be close enough to us to touch us. to heal us, to restore us, to redeem us, to bring his light into our darkness, and to save us. We like that. We like that part of the gospel. Yes. Like, he saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. We like that. We like how we were once lost and Jesus came and saved us. But then here's the twist on this whole gospel, is that the same way that Jesus was hospitable towards you whenever you were a wreck, whenever you wanted nothing to do with him, when you were a mess, how he came close to you and gave you room at his table, we are now to do the same thing for others. And then that's the twist. That's the I was tracking with you, Jesus, as long as it was good and convenient for me. I don't know about this part. But Jesus says, hey, this love that you've been shown, now go show it to others. Spread this thing. Paul writes about this in Romans chapter 15. He says, therefore, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. It's not about us. It's about him. The reason why we welcome people in who are different than us, who it might be an inconvenience to get around, whatever, the reason why isn't for us. It's so that God can get the glory. Christian hospitality is creating a space for others to encounter Jesus. So whatever that looks like for you, there's a variety of ways that we can live this out. We can invite people over to share a meal with us, maybe a neighbor on your street. We can invite someone to get coffee together. We can smile at church, That's one thing. If you see someone come in and they're in your seat, be kind about it. Don't be cranky about it. Just scoot over some. Someone cuts you off in the parking lot here at church, wave at them with all 5 fingers, not just one, and just bless them. Just bless them. Yeah, we don't want to, there's all sorts of things that can be said there. Also, that should apply not just in the church parking lot, but you're kind of representing Jesus everywhere. Be kind. So it's just creating a space for others to encounter Jesus. Jesus is the one who does the saving. We just set the table. We just set the table. Jesus is the one who saves. And so we set the table through these little things that we can do. One author calls it radically ordinary hospitality. And I love that. This is a quote that we read during the series. Rosaria Butterfield wrote, radically ordinary hospitality. Those who live it see strangers as neighbors and neighbors as family of God. They recoil at reducing a person to a category or label. They see God's image reflected in the eyes of every human being on earth. They know that they are like the meth addicts and the sex trade workers. They take their own sin seriously, including the sin of selfishness and pride. They take God's holiness and goodness seriously. They use the Bible as a lifeline with no exceptions. Those who live out radically ordinary hospitality see their homes not as theirs at all, but as God's gift to use for the furtherance of his kingdom. They open their doors, they seek out the underprivileged. They know the gospel comes with a house key. So we started this year off by talking about the gospel, and I want to wrap this year up with talking about how we have seen the gospel at work here in the life of this community of believers. Because here's the thing, the same Jesus that you read about in Scripture who's going about healing and saving and delivering and restoring is still at work today. Healing and saving and restoring and redeeming. That's what Jesus is continuing to do through his church. And I want to share with you just a few ways that we've seen God do it here this year. I reached out to our staff and asked for wins, and I had pages of them. So these are just going to be a few that I'm going to share today. We've had over 170 people surrender their life to Jesus this year. We've baptized over 80 people, and we've experienced growth as a church. And to grow at all right now is phenomenal. To grow 5% would be great, 10% incredible, but as a church, we've grown 15% this year. And And here's why we share this, okay? It's not, our mission as a church isn't to hit a quota. Our mission as a church is to see people transformed by Jesus. And I share those numbers because those aren't just numbers. Behind every number is a name and is a story, is a real person whose life was really changed by Jesus. That's why we share those. We are here, we exist to see people either come into or grow in a life-giving, loving, joy-filled relationship that's transformative with Jesus. That's why we exist as a church. And that's not just what the staff is here for. That's what we as a church are here for. And it's been amazing to see our church engage and step up and to reach out and to help others around them grow. We've seen bodies healed this year. If you were here for the service that my friend Zach led, it was the one that was like 3 hours long. So for the 9 o'clock crowd, they got off easy. It was like an hour-long service. The 11 o'clock crowd, you guys were troopers. You were here till like 2 in the afternoon. But it was awesome. So during that service, he gave a word of knowledge about someone who was experiencing long-term side effects of COVID, specifically shortness of breath. There was a woman in our church who the night before was in the ER for that exact thing. And she was still recovering from it, and she was unable to be at church that morning, but her husband was able to be here. And so her husband came in and said, hey, I think that is a word for my wife, so do you mind if I just kind of step in for her, and we receive that word, and we know that God desires to heal her from it. And so they prayed, and she was healed instantly from, again, this is like long-term lasting stuff that put her in the hospital the night before, and she hasn't experienced it since. And it happened instantly. That's something, by the way, that's available all the time. There are just moments where we're more aware of it than others. But God's will, his heart, is to see his people healed. We've shared testimonies of how people have been healed of cancer this year. We have multiple people who were told that they would never be able to conceive, now carrying in their babies to church. We've launched out a long-term missionary to the country of Uruguay, and so we are excited to see what God does through Joseph and the ministry there. We've partnered with the leader of the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at Austin College to see students discipled in Christ and come into a community of faith. And we've seen just a wealth of generosity in our church. I have lost track of the number of cars that have been given away this year. There's been like this underground car ministry that's been awesome to hear the testimonies from. And there are multiple stories that I could share. And even just 2 weeks ago, I heard a recent one that was amazing. But I want to share this one. It's one that we've shared before, but I love it. So in the first year, or the first Sunday gathering of this year, we had Pastor Dwayne, our founding pastor here, and he was speaking, and he just kind of off the cuff said something about, this year seeing acts of generosity. Things like giving cars away. And little did he know that literally as he's teaching about that, in our kids' hallway, someone was giving a car away. And it was this couple in our church that is they're not incredibly wealthy people. They're normal people. So many times when we hear stories of generosity, we think, that's for someone in a different tax bracket than me, But these are normal people, and God laid it on their heart to meet a need. They noticed this woman who had recently started coming to our church, who was a single mom of 3 kids, and she was coming out of an abusive situation, trying to get her feet back under her, and it's hard to get a job whenever you can't get a ride, And so they saw this need, and they didn't, sit back and take this passive approach of, God, if it really is you, write it out in the stars. No, they just saw this need, they sensed God's heart on it, and they moved forward in it. And so that on the first Sunday of the year, in the kids' hallway, this woman was checking in her kids, and this couple comes up and hands her the keys to a car. And just a few days before this happened, a group of believers were together with this woman, and they were praying, and one of them said, and her kids were present for this prayer, one of the people praying said, I just pray that God's favor will be upon you, that you will find favor with God. Every need you have will be met. Okay, so that happened a few days prior. So whenever, that Sunday morning in the kids' hallway, this woman is given a cart, she falls to the floor and is weeping. And one of her kids who's around her picks her up and says, they were right. We have found favor with God. And there's just something about that story of our children, our grandchildren, another generation, looking at what's happening in this community of people and going, and they just can't help to say, man, look at what God is doing here. We have found favor with God. He is good. He is real. He is near. That's why we're doing this thing. It's to live it out faithfully, not just for our sake, but to be a witness for another generation, so that our kids and our grandkids and the younger people in our church can see and experience the faithfulness of God, not just in some abstract idea, but in a reality. That they can look and they can see, I remember right here where this person got touched by God and they were healed of stage 4 cancer. These moments that mark you forever, that act as those pillars when you look back, when things are shaky and you don't know what's up from down. You look back and you can remember the faithfulness of God. And for every time we have someone on the floor in tears of joy, there's someone on the floor in tears of sorrow. Because though we've had people walk into the church who were told, you'll never conceive, we've had them walk in with their babies. We've also had people in our church experience the pain of miscarriage or the death of a newborn baby. We have things to celebrate, but we also have sorrow and pain and things to mourn. But no matter if this was the best year of your life, or if you look back and this is the worst year of your life, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to come to the Lord and give him thanks and gratitude. And if it was a highlight year, we're going to give him all of the thanks he's due. If it was the worst year of your life, we're going to give him all of the pain and the sorrow that we've been carrying, all of the burdens that we've been trying to bear, we're going to lay them at his feet. And so if you'd stand with me, we're going to close out this year with just coming to the Lord. So if it was your best year, give him your best praise. If it was your worst year, give him your best praise. Because if we can learn how to do this, learn how to worship when times are good and learn how to worship when times are bad, then we will continue to walk humbly and faithfully with God, continuing to come and fall at his feet, giving him everything, all of the good, all of the pain. And so before we enter into singing, I want to invite you to close your eyes and just take a moment to reflect on this year. What are the things that stand out to you from this year? The highlights, the lowlights. Just call those to mind. And then what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to bring all of those before God, giving him gratitude and thanks and sorrow and burdens and pain, because he's worthy of it all.